Okay, one more time, welcome everybody. I'm Mariusz Kozioł. I'm a CTO of Visuality. I will be a moderator today. If you have any question or if there will be any problem with sound, you can write me on chat. You are muted, it's in purpose to not generate chaos. Maybe at the end there will be a space where we can unmute and discuss more. Thank you for coming. It's great that you find time to learn something new with us. Domain-driven design is our priority right now, and hopefully we will share our passion with you. So agenda for today, of course, at the beginning is the most important part with the Pawel's presentation. Then there will be a place for Q&A and answer. If you have any question, write it on chat panel. I will aggregate them and we will try to answer all of them at the end of the presentation. And then there will be a quick survey. It's really important for us to know your opinion. It's our first webinar. We would like to improve. We would like to know what would you like to learn next. Yes. Okay, let's talk about today's speaker. Paweł Strzałkowski is a software consultant and senior Ruby on Rails engineer in Visuality. His skills in different areas, so not only the backend but also front-end with GraphJS and DevOps. He has more than 20 years of experience, so I think we have a good person in a good place. Please write me on chat if the voice is okay. There is already a question. Yes, there will be recording. Hopefully everything will be good. We will send you recordings later. Okay, so I will pass the microphone to Paweł. You know what to do. Good luck. And yeah. We don't hear you. Paweł, we don't hear you.
Small technical problems. What would the world be without it? Okay, so I hope you guys can see everything. And let's start over. So hi, my name is Paweł. I currently work at Visuality as a software consultant, as Mariusz has mentioned, as a team leader, but still as an active Ruby and Ruby on Rails developer. I've been programming since the last century. Half of that was in PHP, and the other half, the happier half, was in Ruby. I've always thought about myself as a full stack developer, so I really don't fear anything from DevOps to JavaScript and beyond. On top of that, I'm a domain-driven design enthusiast, which I would like to show you today. So let's start. Meet Albert. Albert has always wanted to create his own website. He's always been interested in computers and in computer graphics. Once he has even made a simple web page in Java, or maybe in JavaScript. He really doesn't remember. One day, Albert's friend has recommended a well-known and battle-tested framework, Ruby on Rails. She said that using it, it's very easy to create a website. Albert has read the tutorial. It suggested creating a blog with comments, which he thought is odd. So he he was really eager to create a catalog of his beloved Pokemon cards. So he has followed the tutorial. He has added models to the models folder, controllers to controllers, views to views, of course. Well, we all know that MVC is a well-known and proven pattern, right? It should serve well in a modern web application. And in fact, the first 3 months of development have been great. The application has been extremely easy to develop. Albert has been adding new ideas and features in a blink of an eye. And the project started to grow. Albert has added information about card prices. Of course, he has added it as one more attribute to the card model. Just then, he got the first offer to buy one of his cards. Shortly after, next offers came. So Albert has decided to start selling. He has added a new model called Order, which contained all the information about things like payment, shipment, shipping, client information, and so on. I think I know what you guys may think. There are at least 2 very well-known open source e-commerce platforms written in Rails. He could have just used them, but you know, you have a project, you already invested your time, money, and sweat into it, so you'd like to develop it further. And on the other hand, if you take those well-known open source e-commerce platforms and take a look at the Order model, I don't think they are any better than what Albert has come up with. And well, months went by, and Albert started to worry. The app became huge. It had multiple functionalities and several integrations with external systems. And well, making changes became a huge problem. It was harder and harder to pinpoint the rules and details of business logic. Well, Albert felt lost. He tried his best to follow the best practices developed by the Rails community. He has put much of the business logic in the famous service objects. However, it also turned out that some of the business logic is in the models. Quite a lot of it was in the controllers, much more that he would prefer to admit. And unfortunately, some of the business logic was in the views. It has become a mess, a nightmare to extend and to develop. And it just became obvious to Albert that a framework like Ruby on Rails is not a good choice for complex applications. So let's think for a second. What did Albert do wrong? Well, initially, nothing. Initially, he had a CRUD task, very simple, no business logic, just a product catalog. So he's made a CRUD application. However, when the business domain became more complex, he still followed the simplistic patterns learned from the tutorials. He has mixed the entire domain of his business into one tangled monolith and got a big ball of mud. Big ball of mud is a construct described in domain-driven design. It had been described earlier, but domain-driven design also mentions it. It's a system which is, again, tangled, hard to maintain, and almost impossible to coherently develop. But since we mentioned domain-driven design, let's take a look what it is. So it's an approach, it's a set of techniques focusing on modeling software to match, let's read it at first, a domain according to input from the domain's expert. Well, basically it says build software according to the business knowledge. So do not program your applications just as you wish. At first, go to the domain's experts and learn how it should work. A domain expert is a person who, well, is an expert in the business world. Such a person understands the procedures and operations from the real life interactions and experience. So there is someone who actually had done it prior to the moment that you've started even doing your application. Well, domain-driven design is a term coined by Eric Evans in the book Domain-Driven Design, Tackling Complexity in Hardware Software. It was published in 2003. It has been very well received and discussed around the world. There were many other books, many presentations, books, and talks about the topic, but one of the most important is the one written by Vernon in 2013 called Implementing Domain-Driven Design. Those books are usually referred to as the Blue Book and the Red Book. Both, even though they are quite bricky and very well, they have lots of material, they are really fun to read, believe it or not. So let's dive in, let's go back to Albert, and let's see what we can learn from those books. Looking at the business run by Albert, we may list different groups of problems it has to deal with. Well, you have to maintain product catalog, you have to monitor payments, you have to ship packages, and so on. Groups of problems defined like this in DDD are called subdomains. Subdomains have nothing to do with programming. They are definitions, again, definitions of groups of problems to solve. So subdomains are from the business world. But if there are problem spaces, then we have to find the solutions for them. Solutions which we will implement in the code of our application. However, if we create a system implementing a single solution space for all the problems, we get a big ball of mud. And that's very often the case in our applications. Domain-driven design says it would be much better to solve each group of problems in isolation. So since we've had problem spaces, now we are talking about a solution space. And a solution space solving problems related to one or more subdomains is called a bounded context. Inside of a bounded context, you find the domain, so the model, services, persistence definition, and much more. A bounded context allows you to solve the problems of a single subdomain in detachment from the other parts of the system. The optimal solution is to distill a bounded context in a way that each subdomain has its own solution space in the form of a distinct context. But domain-driven design goes further. It's important to notice that the same words and expressions may mean different things in different contexts. For example, a product. In the product catalog, a product is something that has like 1 million attributes. If it's a book, let's say it has author, it has the number of pages, it has, I don't know, a number of chapters, the quality of paper, the type of the cover, or any other attribute. But if we go to the shipping context, a book is really something that has dimensions, maybe weight, and maybe a title, because we have to write something on the label, but that's it. A product is something completely different in the shipping context and in the product catalog context. Therefore, each bounded context has its own language. Such a language is not just created for programmers, and it's also not created for business. It's meant to be used by everybody. Any discussion between like the business and IT, or internal discussions within one of the groups, have to use the same vocabulary. It makes the discussions much easier, and it really allows to pick the brains of the domain experts. Because, well, you know, when the IT world and the business world speak the same language, it's much easier to understand each other. For example, when talking to a domain expert, we don't want to say something like people from IT sometimes tend to say, let's set shipments expected execution at for a date in 2 days. That's like taken from a race application. We would rather say, we plan shipping in 2 days. When we say we plan shipping in 2 days, everyone would understand it. We want to use a simple, clear language, understandable for the domain experts. And also, we want to write software which uses the same nomenclature, the same terms, so that our programmers, when going to business, they can communicate. Such a language, understandable for anybody working within a given context, is called ubiquitous language. It usually has to be intentionally polished and adjusted, sometimes even written down. And in fact, it's an effect of collaborative work of the entire team, business and IT. Ubiquitous language is considered by many to be the most important element of domain-driven design. All right, let's take a look at one more element of the strategic patterns of domain-driven design. I just want to mention it. We won't go into much detail because the topic is vast, but I would really like to show it to you. So having knowledge about subdomains, bounded context, and ubiquitous language, we can use another tool called context map. As you can imagine, if you separate group of problems into, if you separate them and implement solutions for each of the problems in separation, those elements of the system have to communicate. They have to cooperate together for success of the entire system. So their relations and connection may be formed in different ways. The contexts might cooperate or be dependent on each other. They can implement their own model or accept a foreign one. DDD gives us a number of tools to describe this in details. However, even not going into much detail, even simple drawing of the context and their connections give you a great insight into the system. Let's go back to Albert for a second. I can only imagine him listening and nodding his head. I bet he'd say something like, it seems a bit idealistic, that detached from reality, context, UB something, language. Well, I have Rails, I have MVC, and my service objects. What the hell are you talking about, really? Well, Albert is right. We have Rails, but it doesn't mean that we should stick to the simplest way of using the framework. Okay, context or not, there is much more to domain-driven design. But no, it's going to be easier from now on, because we've discussed some of the elements of the strategic domain-driven design, and now we are jumping into tactical DDD. And at the tactical level, we tell how to model the domain, but the domain inside of a single bounded context. That's why we needed to know what the bounded context is. So at the tactical level, DDD helps us to express the business processes within a single context. It also helps to introduce object-oriented programming into your applications, because there is hardly any object-oriented programming in the most Rails projects that I've seen, and I have a chance to see a lot of them. Mostly they are full of procedural service objects, which act as God classes. They perform those services, they perform complex series of procedures, just juggling active records bugs for data. And there is, again, hardly any object-oriented programming in there. So in the next part of this presentation, I would like to tell you about the elements of tactical DDD and how to use them in your projects. As in this part, we will focus on the highlighted elements. These three might be the most valuable for you in the beginning. They will help you to model the domain and keep the model consistent while still programming in the Rails way. This knowledge will also allow us to perform a quick exercise and model a fragment of a domain in Ruby on Rails. So let's dive in. Let's start with the first element of tactical DDD. It's called an entity. Entities are everywhere. They're the basis of any application, right? A typical Rails model is an entity identified by its ID. The main job of an entity is to give the identity and allow to track objects lifecycle. So to quote Eric Evans, an object defined primarily by its identity is called an entity. Most applications orbit around identifiable objects. So there might be users, clients, products, or bank operations. For example, for any e-commerce, it's necessary to track who has purchased what. And for a bank, a bank has to know the identity of any financial operation, even if there are two money transfers with the same amounts. Each operation has its own ID and has to be tracked. And saying a lot about identity has to be given to an object. It's up to the business and the application how to do it and how to choose the approach for entity identification. There are at least a few strategies how to do that. Let's just go over 4 of those. One would be, if you want to create an object in our system, in our application, then the operator, so let's say user, gives a unique value. That might be, for example, an email address during registration. So our user would be uniquely identified by its email address. Another approach would be for the application to generate a unique identifier. That might be, for example, invoice number. It's not really an ID, it's a number, but you would never use two different similar two numbers that are the same for two separate entities. Sorry, a drink of water. So again, application can generate a unique identifier, for example, invoice number, or maybe a UUID. Those are also handy. Another approach would be to generate identifier at the level of persistence. So those would be your auto increments, very typical in every race application, but also persistence can generate you a UUID. So UUID is something quite special because it can be generated on the application level or at the persistence level. The last strategy to apply an identity would be to take the unique identifier, the identity, from outside. So, for example, from another bounded context. But entities, they not only are, but they also do. They do stuff. And through that behavior, they go through a life cycle of changes. A client, for example, or a customer may change phone number. An invoice might be voided or account may be activated. We model entities, giving them methods which allow to change their state. We should not, and we really should not, just operate on setters to change primitive attributes. Methods should express the intention and the purpose. They should be, as Eric Evans often stresses, intention revealing. And what's very important, the names of the method should come from ubiquitous language. So we can, again, talk between the IT and the business fluently. So those will be entities. Now let's jump into the second kind of the tactical element of DBD, called value objects. Well, each entity can be, it doesn't have just the identity and behaviors. It can be described in some way. It has descriptive features. The attributes used for such a description might be primitive strings or numbers, for example, but the attributes describing the entity may also, the attributes may also form more complex objects. So again, to quote Evans, an object that represents a descriptive aspect of the domain with no conceptual identity is called a value object. Let's put that in plain words. So, for example, you have two primitives, and together they form something that's meaningful. For example, two primitive attributes of an entity can form a geographical location. Two other primitives called, let's say, amount and currency may together express a money value. You might have heard about money class representing the value, for example, $5 or €7. So you would have an entity. That entity would have two primitive attributes of an amount and currency. But if you take those two simple attributes as a whole and wrap within an object, that object is called a value object. Well, a single attribute may also be encapsulated like that, and in that way we would give it some more meaning. I will show you more examples in a second. When we implement a value object, we implement it as immutable, so we never change the state of a value object. Once it's created, it never changes. If we want to, for example, add two value objects, the outcome would be a third value object. And we most often implement them as comparable, so we can at least check whether they are equal. Sometimes it's useful to know which is like larger, for example. And again, they have no identity. Going back to the money object, money class, if you have two $5 bills, each has an identity. So each dollar bill is in fact an entity, most probably. But the value of that bill, so $5, that's just the value. It has no identity. Going forward to the third tactical element of DDD, aggregate. This one sometimes is quite hard to understand, and probably mostly because to aggregate means so much in like every language, in English as well. But let's start with the definition by the book, and let's work it until we understand what it is. So an aggregate is a cluster of associated objects that we treat as a unit for the purpose of data changes. Well, an aggregate is a cluster of objects. So it's in fact a group of objects, a group of entities and value objects. But an aggregate is it's a conceptual thing. You can go through an entire code base and see no mention of the term aggregate. You will see the entities, you will see the value objects, but the aggregate is, at least sometimes, expressed only in the way those entities and value objects are organized. An aggregate, so a group of objects, has only one job. The job is to make sure that any change is introduced consistently. When we have such a group of objects, then other elements of the system from outside of the aggregate may communicate with this aggregate only through the entity which has been defined as aggregate root. And the outside elements of the system cannot store references, so for example IDs, to the elements inside of the boundary. And remember, an aggregate is just a group of objects, but a change to such a group, a change to any element of this group may be made only if it doesn't break domain rules. The domain rules are called invariants. So an aggregate is a group of objects that guards that any change is performed by the book and it's not breaking any invariants. Like if a request to an aggregate to change something, to perform an operation, if such a change would break any of the business rules, then such a change request is rejected as a whole and doesn't change any part of the aggregate. Let's take a look at simple and well far-fetched example of an aggregate, but it should be quite easy to understand. Let's take a look at the client aggregate. Aggregates are usually named by the root entity. So we have a root entity which is called client, so it's then a client aggregate. Such a client in this aggregate, a client may have multiple shipping addresses, but the business rule invariant is that a client may have only up to 2 shipping addresses. So we create ourselves a value object, an address in this code snippet is a value object, and we pass it to our client, asking it to add a shipping address. And we provide the value object, which has all the address parameters. The client object may accept it and add this shipping address or reject it. We never operate on the shipping address object because, well, if we would do that, we would lose control over the business rules. And I will show you why in just a minute. Again, the elements from outside of the aggregate may hold only the reference, like ID, to the aggregate root, not to the shipping address. All right, guys. I guess you had enough of the theory. The rest of the presentation is like 90% code. So let's jump into it and let's see how we can code that, all the things in Rails, because there is a place for that. Let's start with an example of, in fact, this is taken from a project I've been in like some time ago. And this example will show you strength of a value object with no entities or aggregates. We'll just look at the value object. Let's take a look at the real life example. So we have a service object, something we all know and love. And this service object has one purpose. It's supposed to send events. By events in here, we mean a string, like saying like user created or invoice voided, something like that. We want to send it to analytics software so that it can be further processed or, well, for whatever reasons. So we want to send events like, again, user registered or something happened in our system, and we send that all to analytics. And this worked fine. However, this feature has been used many times in the code, and the developers changed. And because this project was maintained by like 5+ people or 10+ people at some point. So there were typos. One developer has written user logged. The second one has written like logged user. One has written using small case. The second one used another type of approach. So it was very hard to track, again, in that analytics software. So a new business requirement comes and they say, okay, so let's unify it. Let's use noun and a verb, and let's allow our application to join those two so that we can always find like user created and not created user. And again, very simple solution, and it worked fine. And then a new business requirement came, because there are exceptions, right? There always are. So we want to have a noun, we want to have a verb, but there might be occasionally something that is out of that boundary. So this would be a solution. And I would see something in many Rails projects again. But when I look at it, I immediately think, well, I will have to test it. And if I have to test it by providing all the combinations of a noun, a verb, and an event, and then check what was sent to the client track method, I think something went wrong. When I look at it, I see that it has broken the single responsibility principle. This service had one purpose. This service was supposed to send data to analytics software. And now it deals with how to connect 3 different terms and how to apply logic for that. So let's move this complexity out of this service and let's see how it can be done. Let's use a value object. We can create a class. Let's call it event, because why not? And let's give it 2 methods. The initializer, which would take the name of an event, and a factory method called combination of, where we can provide a noun and a verb. So now we can initialize our event either using the method new or combination of, and we can provide the name or a noun and a verb. This way, the complexity of creating this event and knowing how to create it basically disappears, because any software that uses this class knows that it wants to provide a name, so it does, or it knows it has to provide noun and verb, so it just does. Therefore, our service comes to almost the same state that it had at the very beginning, and the usage is very simple again. And this is an example of how to use a value object to remove complexity from place that it shouldn't be in the first place. But again, those are service objects. Let's jump into application records. So we have a place, and you all know what it is. It's an entity identified at least by its auto increment ID, and it has 3 attributes: name, latitude, longitude. From the description of a thing called a value object, you can probably already imagine that if you connect latitude and longitude, you can form a more complex attribute in the form of a value object. You can use Rails API for that. This Rails API is a method called composed of. So again, it's already in Rails. Most of us just don't use it. And we can define it like this. So if we say we have a value object, we call it coordinates, and we have to provide a class for that value object. So we have to add a class called coordinates in our project with an initializer. And we also have to map the attributes between the attributes of a place and attributes of coordinates. And my subjective feeling, it's not pretty, but well, it works. And it can be very useful. That so I will try to show you that in a second. But this way we can use any instance of a place entity with place.coordinates.latitude longitude. If we want to check whether 2 places are in the same spot, we can just make a call of place.coordinates and check if it equals another place, another place's coordinates. We still have access to place.latitude and place.longitude. So if we want to use those attributes directly, we still can. But just for the sake of having a more readable and intention revealing software, this coordinates might go a long way. All right. So let's see if we can do an exercise and domain and model part of the domain in Ruby on Rails. So guys, imagine a situation when you get a task. So you have something to do, but fortunately, this one time in a lifetime, you didn't get just a new ticket in Jira written by a project manager, which of course does his great work, but this time we got to talk to the client. We got to talk to the client, which will act as a domain expert for this project. So let's see what this domain expert has said. So our client has customers, and the client has to contact those customers. To do that, they use an email address and a phone. Currently, there is no application. They just keep all the information in the books. However, they still can have a noted down email or phone, right? We've also heard that when a customer contacts the client uses the phone number to find the record in the books. So the client identifies the customer by the phone number. each customer has to have a name and a physical address. Well, they sometimes ship things to the customers, so they have to know this stuff. Birthdays are very important because we use them for marketing. Well, pretty much we have to know when to send the birthday card. And they have a loyalty program, so they have to know how long the customer was with this client. And one more thing, the customers get into interactions. So once they do that, they can rate each other with a positive, negative, or neutral mark. But one thing, there may be only one rate from one customer to another. Let's see how we can model that using the stuff that I've told you about. Well, a typical day at work, and we have an awesome ORM in Ruby on Rails. So let's just use it. We have a customer. We just put all the attributes there: phone, email, name, city. Name, let's say city and street stands for the address. And we have birthday and created that and array entity, and that's it. Job is done. We can see how it's going to look in Ruby on Rails. One thing that we can say about it is that it works. However, I don't really see a clear purpose when I look at the code. It's just a bug of data. Validated a bit, but a bug for data. We can, of course, process it in service objects, but then it's up to the service object to watch for data integrity and business rules. If it's just a bug for data, then it's quite visible that there was no design in the process of creating it. And also, even though it's an entity, I don't see a clearly visible identity. So let's use some of the stuff that I told you about, and let's redo this class using value objects. So we still have a customer, but it has much lower number of attributes. The rate is the same. So let's express some of the attributes using value objects. Some of the attributes would go into something called personal information, which would hold name and birthday. And we also have this address value object, which represents physical address as was requested in the task. In the code, it looks like this. So when I have a customer, now I can use customer.address to get a value object with all the address information. I can also write customer.personal information to see a name and birthday. Well, first of all, name is a horrible name for an attribute. It should be called full name. But if we use something like name, in the context, like customer.name might be anything. Might be a company name, might be first name, might be whatever. But when we have personal information.name, it adds information. This personal information part shows what this name is about. So it reveals the intention of this attribute. We stopped using primitive attributes, primitive values, and we started to shape the data and the possible usage of the entity. We still don't have a clearly defined identity, but now it's the moment that we can go back to the requirements of this task and notice that the client has mentioned that when a customer comes to the client, the customer is identified by the phone number. So it means that email is just a way to communicate with the customer, but it doesn't define who it is. So in fact, email doesn't have to be in the customer directly. We need the phone because this is like the main identity, but the email can be moved outside. Now where? This is debatable. We can create a third value object, like let's say contact information, and put the email there. But well, it would be just one attribute and it seems like an overkill. We could put the email into, let's say, address, because, well, address and email address, but the address is more of a physical thing. So it's actually a place. So we can also put the email into personal information. It's maybe not the best solution. And in some, I can imagine that any of the above solutions would be useful in some cases. In here, let's say just for the simplicity sake, let's just put it into personal information and remove it directly from customer. I said remove, but okay, again, you already know that it's not the case. The email is also still in the customer. We just moved it logically into personal information. Now, when we look at the customer class, it's like clearly visible what it does. A customer has an address, physical address, and it has personal information. It also has a phone, which has to be unique. If it has to be unique, then it's most probably something that defines the identity of this class, of an instance of this class. All right, but so we've dealt with the organization of attributes, but we still have rates. We know that customer can give rates. So of course we have Rails API. We can write customer.rate.build or create, and we are done, right? We can move that complexity into service objects. But as I've said, we want to enable object-oriented programming, so we can add methods to our customer. Well, thankfully, we have Ruby 3 now, because otherwise this, and we have one-liners, because otherwise this slide would never be created. But since our client said that customers can give negative, neutral, and positive rates to other customers, we can just model our software in that way. So a customer can give a negative rate or a positive rate. And how it's done, it's implementation detail. So it's private. When a customer is requested to give a negative rate, for example, then we check whether that customer can do that. So maybe we ask him to rate himself, or maybe that rate was already given. If not, we build the rate. This way of modeling software allows us to avoid creating such an ugly service. On one hand, it's totally valid. It works, right? You give it a customer ID. Please don't take photos. It's really bad. You just give the customer IDs and say, okay, mark it with, let's say, 1, or maybe you use some enum or const, and you check whether this customer can give this rate, and so on and so forth. But with software model, like in the previous slide, you can also do this. You can write your service object in an intention revealing way. So you just give it one customer ID and another and call it. And you say, okay, give positive mark. It doesn't get more readable than this. You still have to have this service, because you don't want to do that in a controller, let's say. You need some kind of a layer between the controller and the model to encapsulate this operation. But in here, all the complexity is put into the customer. And this part has one more benefit. If you look closely at these 2 lines, And now bear with me. Let's imagine this service is run twice in parallel with the same attributes, the same customer ID, the same rated customer ID. What would happen? Well, in each service, the customer is loaded and the customer is given the command to give a positive rate. A customer in each of the parallel services resolve the invariance. So it decides, okay, there is no rate yet, I can add it. Then each customer is saved. And each customer adds a rate. Again, we have two services run in parallel. And therefore, we have duplicated rates. To avoid that, we have to add a mechanism. It's called optimistic locking. And guys, if there is one thing I would love you to take away from this presentation, please let it be this. Because although it would be great if you used DDD, you may live without it. But what you actually need is your data to be consistent at all costs. And let me give you just a quick explanation what it is. Optimistic locking allows you to avoid a situation that I just described. And it's very well supported by Rails. All you have to do is you have to add one column to your entity. It's called log version in case of Rails. So each entity has a version. And let's go back to our situation where we have two services run in parallel. So both services load our customer with, let's say, log version 5. The first one is saved. Therefore, the log version automatically updates to 6. Then the second service with customer, again, read with version 5, tries to save customer, but it can't because the customer version is 6 and it was read with 5. What you get from the second service is a, I think, stale object error, which you just have to handle. This way, our customer operates as an aggregate. We've just created an aggregate. You may see that you have no mention of a rate object in here. You have an aggregate root in the form of the customer entity, and you give the customer the request to give positive mark. It operates on rates, but by using optimistic locking, you can keep this data consistent and you push that complexity down to a customer. Right? We did it. We modeled the domain according to the knowledge of domain experts. So exactly what Eric Evans asked us to do. I think we've created quite expressive and intention revealing code, and we have guaranteed the safety of concurrent operations. And the how part is my favorite because we've spent minimal time thinking and listened to the domain expert. And we didn't rely on active record to do the entire job. But well, in fact, the job is not really done because I've started by telling you all about those subdomains and bounded contexts. And our customer model is still responsible for handling everything, like package delivery, transactional emails, marketing actions. It's still in one model. Well, it's fine. It's fine if the application is very small. But if it grows, as in the case of our Albert, at some point, it has to be divided into separate bounded contexts. But that's a story for another time. That's most probably the basis of the next webinar that we'll be having in the nearest future. I would like to leave you with just those two links for now. The first one is my series of articles about DDD, and it's posted on our Visuality pages. And the second is a link to a repository, which one way or the other contains all the used examples, so you can mess with them. Thank you very much. If you have any comments or questions, please for now write them in chat and we'll try to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Paweł, for awesome talk. Maybe we'll wait for a question, if there will be any, because for now there is no. Okay, there is one. Maybe I will be sending it to you. And it's a really interesting question. So can you explain the distinction between DDD services and Ruby on Rails service objects?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this. Is a really great question, and one of the topics that I have argued about. Because okay, so going a bit outside of the scope of this presentation, in DDD we have two types of services. One is called application service, and the second one is called a domain service. So because what I haven't showed you in here, and again, I would love to show you that in another presentation, which it's already ready, so we have to meet again. In DDD, you are urged to split layers of your application. So you just sorry, I have to start over. So application, let's put it simpler. Application layer, application services are services that you would normally use very similarly to what we have in Rails. So application services would be the ones that you call in the controller, let's say, and you pass just primitive attributes that are received by your controller, or let's say a background job, and you pass those to an application service. And application service, now its responsibility is to pass this request to your domain. So your domain are your aggregates, your entities, your repositories, factories, and so on. And when you have your domain, there are sometimes operations that aren't really that well modeled by entities. So, for example, I don't have something on top of my head, but let's see that you have something in your domains or in your business logic that's not really well, you cannot really well model it within an entity or within an aggregate. You have to have this additional tool that does something that's not well modeled within a single entity or single aggregate. Then you put that as a service. So you have two kinds of services. One is this service that is on the application level that just is used within the controller to get simple parameters. And this application service calls your domain. And then when when you have your domain, which just thinks what should happen, how the state of your application should be changed. When there is something there that needs to be performed and it doesn't really fit an entity or just the entity logic, or it doesn't really fit an aggregate logic, then you model this thing, this action as a service object, as a domain service. Well, when you go back to literature and read, for example, Evans, he urges not to overuse service object, domain services, sorry, not to overuse domain services, and to model as much as possible using entities and aggregates, because if you overuse domain services, you get I'm out of words, anemic domain, and it doesn't represent the domain that well. But it's all in the details, so I don't know how much it answers your question. If you could write something in the chat, I would love to hear. Well, yes and no. You've compared. Well, yes, that RAID service object is much like application service. Yet application service RAID service object is bound to be a procedure that joins multiple worlds or contexts or types of usage. And application service is in DDD is really, on one hand, very much simpler, and it shouldn't really contain a procedure of 50 things to do, which, well, RAID service object shouldn't either, but it usually does. But in the gist and in general, yes, exactly what you read. Okay, so
yeah, there is a second question.
A question about value objects. On one of the first slides, you had a bounded context for shipping and a product entity inside. Could that product be modeled as a value object, even if it has an entity defined outside of the shipping context, even if it has an identity? Well, if we put it that way, I just say everything is possible. It depends on what that product is. Like, if it's something that we have to store and we have to keep track of changes of, then it's an entity. It's in fact, well, it's quite complex, and I didn't want to touch every element of it. But for example, you can. I've showed you a very simplistic value objects, but a value object can contain an array of entities. Why not? It can contain anything, but it's very temporal. Well, at least in the modeled realm. So I'm really struggling to put your question into something in my head. Maybe if we have a bit of time after the questions, maybe I can ask you to just use a microphone and we can chat for a second about it, because I feel like I won't get to the gist of your question just by reading the question. So let's continue, and if we have time, let's come back to it.
Okay, the next question is: could you give an example when to use aggregate and when not to use?
Aggregates are tricky because especially for Ruby community or Rails community, because guys, we tend to use database for everything. You just write something.where.something, and we tend to think that we have to operate on database level. So for example, with those RAIDs, if you looked closely at the example, is that when you want to add a RAID, it loads all the rates before it allows you to add a new one. So if you have a system where you have 10,000 customers and they all rate each other, it wouldn't work. So because this aggregate has to check in the code, in the application code, all the rates and check whether there already was a customer rated. So in such a case, when you have to load great amounts of data, then probably this wouldn't work well as an aggregate. And okay, I just realized how loaded this question is, because first of all, you use aggregates, and maybe that should be the simplest answer. You use aggregates when you have business rules to keep. If you don't have business rules, you don't need aggregates. If you have a user and the user has a name and you have no business rules for that name, and callbacks are not business rules. If you have to do something after the name is changed, it's not a business rule, it's a business procedure. But if there are business rules, then you need aggregates to keep them. It's also tricky because yeah, but yeah, again, too much thoughts in my head. Okay, it's just going back to what I've said prior to this. So first of all, business rules. If you have business rules, then you need aggregates to keep them. But it's also quite tricky to model aggregates because again, if we modeled our aggregate just as I have, it would be really dependent on the system whether it can be used or not. For some systems, if we have like 50 customers, that would work. If we have 50,000, that wouldn't work, because we cannot allow our aggregates to be big. In a way, they shouldn't contain too much data because then they would be less efficient in the application. But again, use aggregates when you have business rules.
Okay, there is another question about domains. When creating a greenfield application, it may not be apparent what your domains are. Is it better to build your application for a while and add DDT once the domain is apparent? Or are there other strategies for identifying domains so that you don't have to move things around later? I feel that we touch a lot of topics which will be covered in the next parts.
Yeah, but yeah, you're right. But again, thank you, Mike, for the question, because it comes a lot, and you are totally right. Because I think you kind of know the answer because you have this question. It's very hard at the very beginning to form the domains in the proper way. We are, well, I am, and we are in Visuality in general, great enthusiasts of event storming. So event storming is a workshop that kind of may allow you to get into the domains and really learn the domains just by talking about the application to be. And I can say that, well, if the domains are very obvious, then you can do that. But it's in greenfield is much harder. I have an example application, but again, I didn't want to link it because I will be talking about it in the future, provided you guys will come back. I have an application somewhere in my public GitHub that has two bounded contexts. One of those is so in general, the application is about organizing parties, but it has a premise. Before we organize a party for our client, customer, whatever, we have to negotiate the contract, and we have to sign a contract before we start doing the parties for them. So then, once you have a bit like minimal experience, you right away understand that, hey, signing contracts and negotiating contracts prior to organizing the parties is a different context. because without the contract, there are no parties. So then even in Greenfield, it's quite obvious that we can implement an application which provides two bounded contexts. First for contract negotiations, and the second context, for parties. Then it's quite obvious. But in general, DDD in Greenfield is much harder unless you have something as simple as e-commerce, which probably isn't the best. Sometimes it's not always the best example of DDD, because it's a very well-known domain, but too much talking. Yes, it's much harder in Greenfield to define bounded context. It's much easier in fact in legacy applications, but when you get to legacy, it's sometimes too hard to rewrite it in DDD. So you have to find like your golden rule and the best spot to do it. And again, event storming, we'll be talking about that in the future. If someone is not familiar, great workshop. Well, it's not a miracle, but event storming done right goes a long way.
Okay, thank you very much. There is no more questions. Thank you for all questions. All of the questions was great. Thank you for presentation, Paweł.
Mariusz, sorry, one thing.
Yeah.
If we had like 2 minutes, could we go to the previous question, because this was one unanswered, and I feel bad that I wasn't able to. Can we have like a 3 minutes chat about it? And
there was some.
Yeah.
So I missed it.
No, the question about value object. I don't think I really answered it. And previously I said, well, maybe we can chat about it for just a second, if we could do it now.
Yeah, like you want. Yeah, sure. Or we can finish and then maybe we can unmute and discuss.
Do you know who to unmute?
Yeah. Yes, wait a second, I will find it and I will unmute. Yes, now.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much. It sounds like a silly question, it's true, but it's something that I struggle sometimes. I try to understand. So for me, an entity is something that should have identity, but also behavior. So in this case, in this example, for me was a grade one of the product inside the shipping, because inside the shipping world, the product for me has no behavior. It's not very relevant. I just need to store a bunch of attributes on it, including the identity, because maybe I want to display a link to the product, to the catalog. But that's the only thing I need the identity for. For me, it's more conceptually, it falls more into a value object thing instead of an entity, because I don't need to neither search on the repository for all the shippings that I did for a given product. I don't need these kind of things. So, but it sounds strange to have a value object that represents an entity outside of my bounded context. And that's why I asked the question, does it sound, when it sounds too strange, maybe it's because it's not a good thing to do.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for the explanation. Because the more I think it, I'd say you are totally correct. And maybe in the shipping world, you actually don't have a product, because you basically have a package, or you have a package, and that's your entity. And one of the attributes of that package would be what's inside. And probably that would be just an identifier of the product, which would make it a value object. So yeah, I think you are totally correct in here that you might not even need a concept of a product. It might be there, but only by the Because if you have like 50 books of the same, you have 50 books in your warehouse, it doesn't matter which book you've put into the shipment. You just need an identifier to know what kind of book it is. So yeah, totally. It can be an entity in one context and just a value object in another.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for everybody who stayed to the end. I will put into the chat the link to the survey. And if you have time, I would like to talk a bit about the visuality, because I would like to share with you what we are doing, and maybe you would like to work with us. So, Visuality is a software house from Poland. We are, of course, focused on Ruby and React.js on the front-end part. We are working with clients from around the world, from 3 continents. And we have 16 years of experience, and there are 12 in Ruby, so we are from the beginning. We have diverse types of services. There is not only the development, there is also software consulting company, project management, and DevOps. I really highlight that we are not a software house who deliver only startups and make MVPs all the time. Sometimes there are MVP, and we like to jump into them because it's refreshing. But we have really difficult projects, and we work on them. So we have places to learn. For example, we have our project. It's rewriting the existing application written by scratch by us. It's modular monolith where we are using a lot of DDP principles. So we have our sandbox to learn, to try. Additionally, there are other projects. We have asynchronous event sourcing based on event type project. We have an application, we are working with a client where we have an application with microservice architecture. We are working also with the application where it's an AI and really huge traffic. So there was previously there was a lot of problems with that. We already solved it. Despite the fact that we have hired 3 juniors developers last year, we have still 8.5 average years of experience. So there are people where you can learn from it. We really like to share our knowledge. We are a company oriented on growth, on our skills, on company knowledge, on our know-how. We are going to conferences. This year you can meet us on Wrocław, RB. You can also meet us in Oracle. Probably will be also on Friendly RB. It's a new conference. We are organizing our own meetups in Warsaw. So we really share knowledge with the community. We have backend and frontend meeting every week. So there is space to share knowledge and talk about those all fun projects, because of course you can't be in all those places at the same time. Company culture is really important for us. We are transparent, we're giving constantly feedback, we care about people happiness. There are a group of people who share passion. For example, I'm player of Magic the Gathering. It's a strategy card game, and I have a few other people who play with me. We have also cedar production in the company, in the office. We have also 3 people, crazy guys, who are walking through the mountain 70+ kilometers per day. And we created our own startup based on that. So they attended to a lot of events, and now we are created startup to track events, track walkers and bikers. And now we are organizing. events for those people. We have our blog. Please subscribe. We'll be sending one mail per month about new blogs and about new events, maybe workshops. We are planning also workshops. On top of that, we are training also new Ruby adepts. As I mentioned before, we hired 3 junior developers and we trained them. So we created Visuality Academy and we train a lot of new juniors. 3 of them are with us and other go to other companies. Okay, thank you very much. If you have any questions about the company, about the DD, about the next webinar, please let me know. Here is my contact, my email, and my Twitter. You can find me also on LinkedIn. You can write to me or Paweł. One more time, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your attending. Please fill the survey. We really need your opinion to improve it, and stay tuned. We will send you information about the next webinar. Thank you and see you.
Thank you, guys.